But the issue of sustainability is now a global concern, and if we look over the last 100 years, we see how the temperature globally has increased and how CO2 emissions, the white line, tend to follow fairly closely the temperature increases. Now, many people might argue that this is part of a normal peak, but if we look now over 1,000 years, we see those peaks and troughs, and we see where the last 50 years that temperature rise has increased quite dramatically. And so if we look over the last 400,000 years, we see those same peaks and troughs, and then we see the CO2 concentrations following that fairly closely. Now we look at the CO2 emissions in 2001, and it doesn't take much to, if you look at the new British Stern report, 2035, what it's predicted to be, and in 2050, if we don't actually do anything about it as a global issue, then it doesn't take much looking at that graph to wonder what's going to happen to temperature rises. If we look at the population of the world and how 33% of the population has 94% of the wealth generally in Western industrialized countries and 90% historical greenhouse emissions. And then we look at a pie chart of the different nations, industrialized nations and less industrialized nations around the world in terms of populations. And then we look at the growth in population and industrialization in China, and indeed in Shanghai, where 50% of the world's cement consumption that China accounts for, and have built more skyscrapers in the last 10 years than in the whole of New York. And there's this wonderful slide that I came across by Aubrey Mayer that looks at the CO2 concentrations for different developing countries. And you see here throughout the industrial period of the earlier part of the last century, there's the United States in red, you have the growth here of Russia, and then China's here and India is here. And how if we don't all collectively do something, and there's going to be a flywheel effect with these sorts of nations. It's interesting to read Thomas Friedman recently in the New York Times, who talked about the fact that China is going to be the largest producer of photovoltaic panels. There's a particular entrepreneur there that's setting up quite a major factory in China. Hopefully they will also start to take the ball and run with it, even though in terms of a global consumption, that there will be a flywheel and a delay, but everybody will be having to look at their resources and how CO2 emissions can be cut. And it's not just because we're all sort of green bashers, it's also affecting people's lives, it's affecting the economies around the world. There's Katrina, and the amount of money that is lost in financial losses as well as life losses around the world is of concern. Not to dwell on it, there are many different organizations that are all looking at this. The Stern report is a very famous report in the UK that looks at what will happen with various different temperature rises. Indeed, Tony Blair just recently said, well, we have to limit it to 3 degrees. But 3 degrees, many people are saying, well, hang on a moment, that's not going to work either, because 3 degrees is quite significant.